For 9 days she'd been sitting on the same church step on Atwell Street, and nobody in Federal Hill had asked her name. She was 27, maybe 98 pounds with the baby, wearing a sweater that had given up on her sometime last winter, and her sneakers were lined with cardboard that had gone soft in the rain days ago. She wasn't begging. That's the part people got wrong later. She was watching, because watching was the only thing she'd ever been good at, and because 3 years in a room full of security monitors teaches you the difference between a man walking past and a man waiting. The silver minivan had been parked in 3 different spots that week, and all 3 had the exact same angle on the front door of Ruggiero's. That's when she knew. They weren't looking for parking, they were looking for a shot. Augustine Volparo had eaten lunch at that same table for 11 years, same hour, same plate, and Teddy Ruggiero had stopped asking what he wanted a decade ago. He was 33, built like the amateur fighter he used to be, wrapped now in charcoal Italian wool, and the only thing on his wrist was a scratched-up Timex that had belonged to his father. Men on that street stepped aside when he walked. It wasn't fear exactly. It was arithmetic. Everyone in Federal Hill understood what he could take away without ever raising his voice, and understanding that is a kind of quiet all its own. So when a pregnant woman in a ruined sweater stepped directly between him and his car door, his hulking bodyguard, Salvatore, reached for her before he thought about it. She didn't flinch. She caught Sal's sleeve, pulled it down toward her, and said 6 words in a voice so low he had to lean in. "That car's been watching you. Since Tuesday, and here's what nobody expected, least of all her." He didn't look. A lesser man would have turned his head, and turning his head would have told them everything. Instead he looked at her face, at the dirt and the hunger and the fear, and he saw something underneath it that stopped him cold. Her hands weren't covering her face. They were covering her stomach. He asked who she was. She said nobody. He asked why nobody would speak up, and she went quiet for a long moment before she told him it was because somebody was waiting for him to come home. He didn't correct her. There hadn't been anybody waiting for 4 years. He asked for the plate number, half expecting nothing. She recited it. Then the days. Then the times down to the minute. What she didn't tell him that afternoon, what she wouldn't tell him for days, was that she'd already saved his life once, years ago, from a chair in a control room he'd never known existed. And what neither of them knew yet was that the men in that minivan hadn't come to Providence for him at all. They'd come for her. If you're already feeling this one, do us a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Share it with somebody who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because stories like this one deserve to be finished. Now let's go back to that rainy street in Federal Hill and find out what that woman had been carrying in her pocket the whole time. That pocket didn't hold much. A few small bills, mostly coins, enough to jingle when she walked, but not enough to buy anything that could rightly be called a meal. Then there was a piece of paper folded into quarters. It had gone soft as cloth, because she had unfolded and refolded it so many times that the creases were no longer creases at all, but tears that hadn't quite broken through. On it was a name, written carefully in capital letters, the handwriting of someone who wanted to make certain that whoever looked at it could read it, and beneath the name was a Vermont number. She hadn't given it to anyone, not once. She carried it the way people carried a last will, not because they believed it would ever be used, but because leaving it behind would have been worse. There was one more thing in her wallet, a sheet printed from a public computer at the library, folded even smaller than the other piece of paper, and pushed deep into the bottom like something a person hid even from herself. She had read it exactly once. Then she had deleted the browsing history before rising from the chair, an old habit from the years she had spent sitting in front of screens, when she had learned that everything she opened left a trail for someone to examine later. She knew what the swelling in her ankles meant. She knew what the dull ache beneath the ribs on her right side meant, the kind of pain that didn't resemble any of the pains people said were normal during pregnancy. She knew what the tiny spots of light that sometimes drifted across her vision late in the afternoon meant. She had gone to a free clinic on the south side of the city and sat beneath harsh white fluorescent lights among people who, like her, had nothing, and when her turn came, the nurse there was very kind. That was what she remembered most. The nurse was young, her voice gentle, and she truly wanted to help. She only needed one document, anything at all. An old driver's license would do. even if it had expired. A library card would do. A bill with a name and address would do. Maeve opened her wallet in front of her, opened it all the way, hiding nothing, and inside there were only a few coins and a name written in capital letters on a piece of paper worn soft. The nurse stared into that wallet for a long time. Then she looked at Maeve's belly, then down at her ankles, and Maeve saw her eyes linger there for one beat longer, and she knew the nurse understood. She had studied for years to understand what that was called, and now she was looking directly at it. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Then she said, "I'm so sorry," and she meant it, and that was what hurt the most. No one was cruel. No one threw her out. No one laughed. No one called her a freeloader. The woman sitting in front of her wanted to save her and couldn't, because there was a blank box on the form, and Maeve had nothing to put inside it. The system didn't hate her. The system simply couldn't see her. She walked out into the afternoon that day and stood on the sidewalk for a while, one hand resting on her belly, and she understood that she was carrying a clock inside her body that no one was willing to listen to as it ticked. And now, on that 9th day, she was standing in the rain on Atwell's Street, and the man whose sleeve she had just grabbed didn't say another word. He simply listened to the entire license plate number. He listened to every date, every hour. Then he turned his back on her. He went inside the restaurant, pulled out a chair, sat down in the same place where he always sat, and ordered another cup of coffee. Through the rain-streaked window, Maeve watched Teddy Ruggiero pour it for him without asking a question, and Maeve stood frozen in the rain, water running down the bridge of her nose, both hands still cradling her belly, with only one thought in her mind, that she had gambled the only thing she had left, her invisibility, and she had lost. She thought he didn't believe her. She thought he had listened to the end, and decided she was simply a madwoman. She didn't understand, because there was no way she could understand, that his turning away and sitting down was the only thing he could have done if he believed her, that standing in the street and looking around would have told the men inside the minivan everything. That sitting down and ordering another cup of coffee was how a man told the entire street that nothing had happened today. Inside the restaurant, Gus's trusted assistant, Corrado Bellini, known to everyone simply as Rado, closed the leather-bound notebook very slowly and rose to his feet. He went out through the back door, stood beneath the awning where the smell of bread mingled with the smell of garbage, and made a very brief call. He said only a few words. Then he hung up, removed his glasses, cleaned them, and put them back on. When Rado came back inside, he didn't sit down at once. He stood beside the table for a moment, opened the notebook to another page, and began speaking about something entirely different, in the flat, even voice of a man reading the weather report. There was a restaurant owner at the other end of the street, a man named Hollis Grady, who hadn't paid his share in a long time. He hadn't forgotten. He wasn't short of money, he simply hadn't paid, and the week before, when someone had stopped by to remind him, he had sent back a message. Rado repeated the message word for word, adding nothing and leaving nothing out, his voice still as even as before. Gus didn't become angry. He didn't set down his coffee cup, didn't frown, didn't do anything at all through a silence long enough for Rado to finish wiping his lenses. Then he asked a question that seemed to have nothing to do with the matter. Did that restaurant use its own linens? Rado said yes, the napkins, the tablecloths, and the aprons. Gus gave the slightest nod. "Stop delivering the linens," he said. Rado wrote it down. "Stop the ice." Rado kept writing, "Stop the garbage service." Rado's pen paused on the final word, and the only sound left in the restaurant was the coffee machine releasing one long breath. Rado looked up. "That's all," he said. "Yeah," Gus said. Rado closed the notebook halfway, then opened it again. The way people did when there was still one question they hadn't asked. "You don't want to send anyone over to talk to him?" he asked. Gus looked through the window clouded with rain, toward the street where the rain was still falling, and a woman was still standing with both arms around her belly, and he answered without looking at Rado. "If we talk to him, he'll have a story to tell," he said. "Let him explain to the inspector why the garbage is piled all the way to his door." Rado closed the notebook completely. A few days later, Hollis Grady's sign had been taken down, and not one person had laid a hand on him. But that belonged to a few days later, for now, on Atwell Street. The rain was still falling, and the broad-shouldered Salvatore Ferretti was doing the hardest thing a large man could do, which was not to look. He didn't look at the silver minivan even once. He didn't glance toward it. He didn't turn his head. He simply raised his collar, stepped out from beneath the awning like a man who had just remembered something he needed to buy, and walked past 3 storefronts to Mrs. Sophia's flower shop. He bought a bouquet of white daisies, the cheapest kind, and Mrs. Sophia wrapped them in newspaper because it was raining that day. On his way back, he stopped. He stopped at exactly one place on the sidewalk, not one step too soon and not one step too late, and he pulled the small card from the bouquet and stood there reading it. The card was blank. He read it with great concentration. He stood there through precisely the right length of silence, the kind of silence that anyone sitting behind a long lens would recognize as too long to be accidental and too brief to be deliberate. And throughout that silence, his broad back remained directly between the silver minivan and the door of Ruggiero's. Then he slipped the card into his pocket and continued walking. At the same moment, a white delivery truck with Volparo and Son printed along its side turned onto the street, slowed down, and stopped at the mouth of the only alley leading behind the row of buildings. The driver switched on the hazard lights, climbed out, took a clipboard in his hand, and began studying it with the grave attention of a man who had just discovered a serious mistake in an order. The rear doors of the truck didn't open. At the far end of the street, a dark blue commercial garbage truck crawled forward, wheezing as it came, and parked at an angle in the way every garbage truck in the world seemed to park, taking up one full lane and half of the other. No one honked. Not one person in the line of cars behind it sounded a horn. Not one pedestrian stopped to look. This was Federal Hill. And on Federal Hill, when the garbage arrived earlier than usual, people understood that this was a day to take another road. Then Sal placed the bouquet of daisies on the front seat of the Lincoln, settled behind the wheel, and eased the car away from the curb, slowly, at the same speed he drove every day. The turn signal blinked for a full 3 beats before he made the turn, like a man running an errand with nothing in the world to hurry for. The flowers remained untouched on the seat, wrapped in newspaper that was slowly growing wet, and no one inside the car handed them to anyone. Inside the minivan, Delroy Fisk sat alone and began counting the things that were wrong. It was an old habit, the only thing left from his years in the military that he could still use, and it had never deceived him. You didn't recognize a trap by seeing it. You recognized it by counting the things that should have been there and weren't. The first wrong thing was the white truck. It had been sitting at the mouth of the alley for a while now, its hazard lights blinking, the driver still bent over the clipboard, as though the Bible had been written on it. But the rear doors hadn't opened. Fisk had spent enough time sitting on streets like this to know what a delivery truck looked like. People opened the back doors before reading the paperwork, not after, because the order was inside the truck, not inside their heads. That truck hadn't come to deliver anything. It had come to stand there. The second wrong thing arrived more slowly, and when it did, a chill ran down his spine. The large man had gone to buy flowers. Fisk had watched him step out, walk past 3 storefronts, and return carrying a bouquet of white daisies wrapped in newspaper. The man had even stopped to read the card, standing in the middle of the sidewalk and studying it for so long that Fisk had lowered the camera and waited. Then the man had continued on, climbed into the Lincoln, and driven away, and the daisies had remained on the seat. No one had handed them to anyone. No one had gotten out of the car and carried them into the restaurant. No woman had stepped outside to receive them. That bouquet had never been flowers. It had been an excuse for a broad back to stand in one place for a certain length of time, and Fisk realized that throughout that entire interval, he hadn't been able to see the restaurant door, and he hadn't even noticed that he couldn't see it. The third wrong thing was the garbage truck. It had parked at an angle at the end of the street, blocking the way, and not one car behind it had honked. Not one. Fisk had worked in enough cities to know that anywhere in America, when a garbage truck blocked traffic during rush hour, someone would sound a horn within 10 seconds, and within half a minute someone would roll down a window and start cursing. Not here. Here, people simply backed away in silence and turned onto another street, the way they stepped around a puddle without needing to look down, because they had known it was there before they arrived. But what truly frightened him wasn't those 3 things. It was the fourth, and it wasn't something that was present, but something that was absent. No one was looking at him, not one person. It wasn't the way people politely avoided looking at an unfamiliar vehicle. It was absolute, clean, Not a single glance touching the minivan during that entire stretch of time. And that could only happen if someone had told them beforehand. Fisk sat motionless, both hands resting on the steering wheel, and told himself the thing he didn't want to say aloud. If they looked at me, it means they're trying to scare me. If they looked at me, it means there's still room to negotiate. It means there's still a conversation waiting somewhere ahead. But no one was looking at me. No one looking at me means there's nothing left to say. It means they've already decided. He reached for the phone and dialed. It rang twice. Wendell Pruitt answered in the maddeningly calm voice of a man sitting in Hartford, a full hour's drive away, inside an air-conditioned office with certificates hanging on the wall. Fisk spoke very quickly and very quietly, never taking his eyes from the rearview mirror. He told him about the truck that hadn't opened its doors, about the bouquet still lying on the seat, about the fact that not a single horn had sounded. The other end remained silent longer than Fisk expected, and in that silence he could hear Pruitt breathing, and there was nothing calm about that breath. "Pull out," Pruitt said. "Pull out now." Fisk asked about the device. Pruitt said leave it, and his voice was different now. Something beneath the surface had cracked, something Fisk had never heard in the 4 years he had worked for him. "You've only got a few minutes," Pruitt said. "Go." Fisk ended the call, dropped the phone onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. The engine started on the first turn, and that was the only thing that went Fisk's way during that entire afternoon. He shifted into reverse, turned to look over his shoulder, and saw that the dark blue garbage truck had crept a little farther forward while he was on the phone, just far enough to close the final gap between it and the line of parked cars along the curb. There was no one inside the garbage truck's cab. Or there was, but whoever it was had bent down to do something and hadn't looked up. Fisk shifted into drive. Ahead of him, the white truck remained at the mouth of the alley, its hazard lights blinking steadily like a healthy heartbeat, while the driver continued studying his clipboard with the patience of a man who had the entire afternoon to read it. This street was narrow. Fisk had known that from the first day, and he had written it into his report as an advantage, because on a narrow street, the camera didn't need a long lens. Now he sat between two sealed exits and understood that the advantage had never belonged to him. He looked toward the sidewalk on his right. It was only a few feet away. Leave the vehicle, leave the camera, leave everything. Open the door and walk perfectly normally, reach Broadway and take a cab. He placed his hand on the door latch, and at that exact moment the door of Ruggiero's opened. Agustin Volparo stepped out into the rain with a cup of coffee in his hand, bareheaded, his collar still lying flat. He didn't look around, he didn't signal to anyone. He simply walked, and he walked slowly, at the pace of a man stepping outside for a cigarette and nothing more, while the rain began gathering in tiny beads across the shoulders of his charcoal wool suit. Fisk took his hand away from the latch. He didn't decide to do it. His hand moved on its own, the way a small animal freezes when a shadow passes over the ground. And even much later, when Fisk told someone else what had happened, he still couldn't explain why he hadn't run. Volparo walked alongside the minivan. He didn't stop beside the driver's door. He continued a little farther, until he stood level with the front of the vehicle, and remained there for a moment, looking through the windshield, directly at the place where Fisk sat, through the glass with its wipers turned off, and a veil of rain streaming down in crooked lines. Then he transferred the coffee cup to his left hand. He raised his right. It was a hand with two knuckles larger than they should have been, the knuckles of the index and middle fingers, an old deformity a man only acquired after years of striking things that refused to give way, and Fisk could see it clearly, because only a single layer of glass separated it from his face. Tap. The finger struck the windshield. Tap. Not hard, not fast. Tap. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, the rhythm of a man tapping on a neighbor's door to ask if he could borrow a ladder. Then the hand lowered, and Volparo stood there waiting. Fisk rolled down the window. He couldn't think of a single reason to do it, but he did. Cold air, the smell of rain, and the scent of coffee entered the vehicle all at once. Volparo said nothing. He only looked at him, and the silence stretched on for a very long time. Long enough for Fisk to hear the windshield wipers of some car on the next street. Long enough for him to hear the steady clicking of the white truck's hazard lights. Long enough for him to begin saying something and then swallow the words when he realized he had been about to explain himself. Volparo didn't ask who he was. He didn't ask what he was doing there. He didn't ask what was inside the minivan. He lifted the coffee cup, took a slow sip, then lowered it, and at last he opened his mouth, and the entire sentence contained only a few words, spoken so softly that Fisk had to lean toward the open window to hear them clearly. "Who's paying you?" Fisk didn't answer the question. He sat motionless, both hands still resting on the steering wheel where he had placed them without being told, and Volparo didn't ask again. He simply stepped back, and at some point no one had noticed. The Lincoln had returned and parked directly behind the minivan. Salvatore Ferretti got out, walked around to the rear, and opened the trunk. No one yanked open a door. No one dragged anyone out of a seat. The entire street remained as quiet as an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and that was what made Fisk go cold. That normalcy, the way they did this as though they had done it 100 times before, and would do it 100 times again. There was no gun in the trunk. Sal stood looking down into it for a moment, and the first thing he said to Gus wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. "No gun, boss," he said. Gus didn't answer. Inside the trunk was a hard black plastic case, and when Sal opened it, there was a camera body and a lens as long as a drain pipe, the kind of lens people didn't use to photograph weddings. There was a tripod folded neatly away. There was a crumpled black cloth that Sal picked up and then dropped again, because he didn't understand what it was for. And there was a laptop, its lid closed but its power light, still breathing a steady point of light in the darkness of the trunk, like something alive. Sal opened it right there on the trunk lid beneath the rain, shielding it with his shoulder. There was no password. That was the detail Rado would repeat again and again later, that people didn't put passwords on things they believed were legal. The screen lit up and there were thousands of photographs inside, arranged by date, named by date, orderly, as the records of a real company. Sal scrolled. Gus stood beside him, not holding the mouse, not touching the computer, only watching. He saw himself walking along Etwells Street. He saw himself sitting at his table inside the restaurant through the window, photographed from an angle he knew exactly. He saw himself standing outside the doors of a church, alone, holding his hat in one hand, and he remembered that morning. Remembered that he hadn't gone inside. He saw himself getting into the car, getting out of it, handing money to Teddy Ruggiero at the counter, and he knew that moment had been when he paid for lunch. But he also knew a photograph couldn't say that, and he understood at once that this was exactly why it had been taken. Sal kept scrolling. The folders were named with initials, with months, with street names. Then the cursor stopped. There was one folder that wasn't like the others. It had no date. It contained only one word, written in capital letters, and that word was family. Sal looked up at Gus. Gus said nothing. Sal opened it. There were no photographs of him inside, no photographs of anyone still breathing. There was only the same angle repeated over and over again, taken through the iron bars of a fence, from outside, from the road. The same distance, the same place to stand. And when Sal glanced at the dates on those photographs, he saw that each one was exactly 1 year apart, the same day of the year after year. Someone had returned to that exact place, on that exact day, regularly, patiently, without missing a single time. Sal shut the laptop. He closed it quickly before the cursor had even finished moving, and the dry snap of the lid sounded sharp against the rain. "That's enough, boss," he said. Gus didn't become angry. That was what Sal would remember forever. There was no shouting, nothing was struck, not one word was spoken. Gus simply stood there for another moment, then turned away, walked several steps back to the front stoop of Ruggiero's, and sat down. The man the entire street moved aside for when he passed sat on a rain-soaked step, beneath the downpour in a $3,000 wool suit, like someone who had walked too far. He was still holding the cup of coffee, and the surface of the coffee began to tremble in tiny, even circles, and it took Sal a moment to understand that it wasn't the rain falling into the cup. Gus's hand was shaking. Sal had followed this man for 11 years and had never seen that happen once. He said nothing. He didn't step closer. He only turned his face away and looked toward the end of the street, where the garbage truck was still parked at an angle, and he stood that way, with his back turned, until his boss rose to his feet. Rado was the one who reopened the laptop, because Sal refused and Gus wouldn't touch it. He set the computer on the open trunk lid, shielding it from the rain with his entire body, and he didn't return to that other folder. He went straight down, farther down to the place no one had noticed, to the faded name at the bottom of the list like one last piece of cleanup that had been forgotten. It was called maintenance. Rado opened it. There were no faces inside, no streets, no restaurant. There was only the underside of the Lincoln, photographed from below, taken from a place no one could reach, unless they lay flat on the pavement. There were photographs of where the car was parked at night, taken from across the street, taken after dark, showing the rear lot behind the funeral home where Sal always left the car overnight. There were photographs of the entrance to that lot, photographs of the lock, and photographs of the fuel tank, close and sharp, close enough to show even the scratch on the cap. Radosa said nothing. He stood there for a while, then removed his glasses. He used the inside edge of his coat to wipe the lenses, cleaning them very carefully on both sides, then put them back on and adjusted the frames with 2 fingers. Sal knew that habit. Everyone in the organization knew that habit, and everyone knew it appeared only once in many years, and it didn't mean Rado was thinking. It meant he was afraid. Then Rado turned toward Gus and said it quietly, in the same flat voice he always used when reading the books, and it was that flatness that made the words unbearable. "This is exactly like the file on your wife's case," he said. "The same angles, the same sequence." No one said anything more. Rain continued falling onto the open trunk lid, tapping against the plastic in small, even beats. Gus remained still for a very long time, and in that silence, no one on the street could know what he was thinking, not even the 2 men who had followed him for all those years. Then he turned his head slowly and looked toward the church steps at the far end of the street, where a woman soaked through by the rain was still standing with both arms around her belly, not leaving, not daring to leave, unable to understand why she was still there. She doesn't know. That was what Gus thought, and the thought came so clearly it might have been spoken aloud. She has no idea what she just prevented. She only saw a vehicle parked where it shouldn't have been. Then he turned back to the work at hand, and his voice returned to normal, so normal that Sal felt a chill rise over his skin. "Take the computer," he said. "The camera, too. Don't break anything." Sal carefully wrapped the laptop in the black cloth he hadn't understood before, and now it served to keep off the rain. Gus walked to the driver's window. Fisk was still sitting exactly where he had been, both hands on the steering wheel, his face drained white. "Your wallet," Gus said. Fisk handed it over between 2 fingers. Gus didn't open it to look for money. He pulled out the driver's license, held it in front of his phone, took 1 photograph, turned it over and took another, then slid the license back into its proper place in the wallet and handed it through the window. "You keep your money," he said. "I keep your name." Fisk took the wallet with a hand that had lost all feeling. Gus stepped back and looked over the minivan from front to rear, the gaze of a man taking measurements, not a man consumed by anger. Sal asked if they should tow it away, boss. Gus shook his head. "Leave it there," he said. "Everyone who passes will see it. That's the signature." Then he gave Fisk his final instruction, and he didn't raise his voice, didn't lean through the window, didn't do anything except speak. "Walk," he said. "Go to Broadway. Don't look back." Fisk opened the door and stepped down, and his legs nearly failed beneath him. He walked. He walked down the middle of a street where no one looked at him, just as no one had looked when he arrived, only now he understood what that refusal to look meant. The silver minivan remained in the middle of Atwell Street. The driver's door open, the interior light still glowing, the trunk still raised toward the sky to catch the rain. It would remain there until the following morning, and everyone who passed would see it. Gus walked back across the street, still holding the cup of coffee that had gone completely cold because he had forgotten it was in his hand. She was still there. That was the first thing he noticed, and it slowed his steps for a moment. She was still standing in the rain, in the exact place where she had been when he turned his back and went into the restaurant, without having moved a single step, and by now she was so thoroughly soaked that the sweater had lost all shape. It had become nothing more than something heavy clinging to her body. Her hair was plastered to her temples. Water ran down her chin and along her neck, and she didn't wipe it away. Both arms were still wrapped around her belly, the posture she hadn't abandoned once, not when he passed her on his way to the minivan, not when Sal opened the trunk, not even when a strange man walked past her toward Broadway, on legs that could barely hold him upright. She had been given the entire afternoon to run. There had been moments when everyone on the street was looking elsewhere, moments when not a single person was watching her, moments when 3 steps would have carried her into the alley behind her, and no one in the world would ever have found her again. She hadn't run, And when Gus came closer and looked into her face, he understood why. It wasn't because she was brave. It wasn't because she was waiting to be thanked. She hadn't run because she had nowhere to run to. He stopped at a distance that allowed her to look at him without having to tilt her head back. "What is your name?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately, and the silence lasted long enough for Gus, who had sat across from every kind of person in his lifetime and learned to read each second of silence as though it were a sworn statement, to understand that this wasn't the hesitation of someone inventing a name. This was the hesitation of someone calculating how far her real name would travel once it left her mouth, who would repeat it, which ledger it would enter, and whose ears it might eventually reach. He had seen that hesitation before. He had seen it in men sitting in back rooms with both hands resting on the table. He had never seen it in a pregnant woman standing in the rain. "Maeve," she said. "Maeve what?" he asked. This time, the silence lasted even longer. She lowered her eyes. Water fell from the tip of her nose onto the front of her sweater. "Just Maeve," she said. Gus didn't ask again. He looked down at her belly, rising with cruel prominence from a body whose every other part seemed to be disappearing, her collarbones showing like two ridges beneath the wet wool. He looked at her shoes. He saw the edge of the cardboard protruding from beneath the left sole, soaked through, softened, and fraying into fibers. He knew what that meant. He knew that when a woman lined her shoe with cardboard, it meant she had calculated her choices and chosen cardboard over another pair of shoes, because cardboard was free. Then he looked back at her face and saw the faint crescent-shaped scar at the edge of her left eyebrow. Something no one could have noticed from a distance through the rain and grime, but something he could see from where he stood. Gus didn't ask another question. He was a man who had spent his entire life in a world where questions were the most dangerous things people could give one another. He had seen people die because they answered a question. He had seen people die because someone else learned the answer. He knew, more clearly than anyone standing on that street, that there were questions which didn't kill a person by your own hand, but opened a door and told death where to find them. He didn't ask where she had come from. He didn't ask where she lived. He didn't ask who had reduced her to this. He didn't ask who the father of the child was. He stood in the rain with a woman who had no last name and asked her one question, and that question wasn't about her. "What can you eat?" he asked. "Is there anything you can't eat?" Maeve lifted her eyes. She looked at him, and for one brief moment she didn't understand. Then she did. She understood that this man had asked about the baby, rather than about her. That he hadn't asked whether she was hungry, but whether there was anything she needed to avoid. The kind of question people only asked after they had already decided to feed someone, and she began to cry. Not aloud. Her face simply broke apart, and in the rain no one could have told the difference, but Gus was standing close enough to see. She wiped her face with the wet cuff of her sweater, a meaningless gesture, then said something that sounded like "thank you," though the words were unclear, and turned away. She managed 3 steps. Then she stopped. She stood motionless in the middle of the sidewalk for a moment, her back to him, both shoulders drawn tight, and Gus thought she was about to fall. Then she looked back. "You don't recognize me," she said. Gus didn't answer. He didn't ask her to repeat herself. He only stood there while the rain continued falling across his shoulders, the cold cup of coffee still resting in his hand like something someone had mistakenly given him. "I used to work somewhere," Maeve said. Her voice wasn't trembling anymore, and that was the strangest part. It was flat, almost calm, the voice of someone reciting something she had rehearsed many times in her mind, but had never once spoken aloud. "A room with no windows," she said, "an entire wall covered in screens. I worked the afternoon shift, and on the afternoon shift no one spoke to anyone. People just sat and watched. They paid me to watch. 3 years, and one of those screens showed St. Anne Cemetery." Gus didn't move, but Sal, standing several steps away beside the Lincoln, saw something change in his boss's shoulders. Not much, only that something which had been holding itself together was no longer holding. "I saw you," she said. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know your name or what you did. I only knew there was a man who came on one day every year and stood in one place beside that fence. It was raining that day. You didn't open an umbrella. Maybe you didn't have one, or maybe you had one and didn't open it, I don't know. You just stood there for a very long time. I sat there watching you through the screen while I ate my lunch, and I realized I was looking at someone in a place where no one should be allowed to look at another person. Then I realized the camera was recording. She stopped. Water ran down her face, and this time she didn't wipe it away. I turned it aside, she said. Not much, just enough to move that corner out of the frame. Then I wrote in the shift log that the servo was broken. And then what? Gus asked. Those were the first words he had spoken in all that time, and he said them so softly that Maeve needed a moment to hear them. Then they put it in my file, she said. No one fires anyone over one broken servo. They only put it in the file. And files never disappear. They don't go anywhere. They simply lie there in silence, waiting until someone needs a reason. Then she turned away again, and this time her voice was quieter, and she spoke without looking at him. I didn't come here to ask for anything, she said. I already paid in advance. Gus said nothing. He stood there in the middle of Atwell Street, beneath the November rain, and remained silent for a very long time. Long enough for Sal to begin feeling uneasy. Long enough for the cup in Gus's hand to fill with a little more rainwater. He was thinking about a morning many years ago that he had never told anyone about, never mentioned to Rado, never spoken of even to Teddy Ruggiero. The morning he had stood outside that fence because he couldn't make himself go inside, and he had believed there wasn't a single person in the world who had seen him that morning. He had lived for 4 years with that belief. He had built the whole of himself upon it, and now he knew that someone had seen him. A complete stranger, sitting in a windowless room on the other side of the city, and the only thing she had done when she saw him was turn her eyes away and pay the price for it. Then Gus handed the cup of coffee to Sal. Sal took it without understanding, and Gus did something Salvatore Ferretti had never seen him do in all the 11 years he had followed him. Not once, not even at funerals, not even in hospitals, not even on the night at the warehouse that neither of them would ever mention again. He removed his charcoal wool coat. He did it slowly, with both hands, like a man taking off something heavy. Then he stepped forward and held it out to her. Not a word, no explanation. He didn't tell her to put it on. Maeve looked at the coat, then at him. Then she reached out with both hands and took it. And it was far heavier than she had expected, and it was still warm. Inside Ruggiero's, it was warm and bright, and smelled of bread. And when Maeve stepped through the door, wearing a wool coat twice the size of her body, not one person in the restaurant looked up. It wasn't because they hadn't seen her. It was because Teddy Ruggiero stood behind the counter and swept her gaze across the room just once. And that single look was enough to make every head in the restaurant find somewhere else more worthy of attention. Gus pulled out a chair at his table, the corner table in the back, and sat down in the place where he always sat. He didn't invite her to join him. He only nudged the chair opposite him outward with the toe of his shoe, then looked away, and Maeve sat down. Rado sat to the left, his leather notebook closed, one hand resting on its cover. Sal remained standing, because Sal always stood. Teddy went into the kitchen without asking a single question. She returned a little while later and set a plate in front of Maeve. Not a small plate, not something polite. It was a full plate, meat and potatoes and bread, with a bowl of soup beside it, the kind of meal she served to men who had spent the entire morning unloading freight. She set it down, placed a fork and spoon beside it, and walked away. She said nothing. Maeve didn't eat. She sat perfectly still. Both hands rested in her lap beneath the table, where no one could see them, and she stared at the plate as though it were a strange object someone had set before her in a language she couldn't speak. Steam rose from it, the smell rose from it, and she didn't touch it. Teddy came back after a while and stood at the end of the table, wiping both hands on the towel draped over her shoulder. "Why aren't you eating?" she asked. Maeve didn't look up. "How much is it?" she asked. "No charge," Teddy said. Then there was a silence, and in that silence, Maeve said something very softly, so softly that Rado would later say he wasn't certain he had heard her correctly, though he knew he had, because the words remained in his mind for months afterward. "Then what do I have to pay with?" she asked. She didn't say it defiantly. She didn't say it bitterly. She said it in the voice of someone asking a practical question. The voice of a person shopping who wanted to know the price before picking something up. The voice of someone who had learned that everything in the world had a cost. And when people didn't tell you the price at the beginning, they charged it later, and it was always higher. The entire table fell silent. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the silence of 4 adults understanding the same thing at the same moment, and what they understood was that this hadn't happened only once. Someone had fed her for free before. Many people had, and she had learned the price. Teddy stood motionless, the towel still in her hand. Rado took off his glasses and put them back on without cleaning them, a broken movement, one he hadn't meant to make. And Gus Volparo, the man who had just left a vehicle dead in the middle of the street like a signature, the man who could erase a restaurant without laying a hand on anyone, set his coffee cup down on the table. He lowered it very slowly, so slowly that it made no sound at all, and Sal, standing beside the door, the man who had barely spoken a sentence throughout that entire afternoon, was the first to turn his face away. He looked through the rain-clouded window toward the street as darkness slowly gathered. And he stood that way, motionless, and no one in the restaurant asked him why. Then Teddy Ruggiero pulled out the chair across from Maeve and sat down. Everyone in the restaurant knew Teddy never sat. She didn't sit with customers, didn't sit with family, didn't sit with Gus, didn't sit with anyone during all the years the restaurant had been open. Because she always said that once she sat down, her shift was over. She sat down. She pushed the plate a little closer to Maeve. "Listen to me," she said. "At this table, people pay by finishing their food. That's all. Nothing else. There will never be anything else." Then she added, her voice drier now, almost sharp, "Eat slowly or you'll throw up." Maeve picked up the fork. She ate. And she ate quickly at first, the first few bites so fast that Teddy had to reach out and touch her wrist once before immediately drawing her hand back, and Maeve slowed down. Then she continued eating that way, and while she ate, she cried. She didn't sob. She made no sound. Her shoulders didn't shake. The tears simply kept falling, running down her cheeks, down her chin, dropping onto the plate, and she didn't wipe them away. Didn't stop, didn't apologize, and kept lifting the fork to her mouth, one bite and then another, because she had learned a very long time ago that when food was placed in front of you, you had to finish it, no matter what you were feeling. The back room at Ruggiero's contained only a wooden table, 3 chairs, a single light bulb hanging low, and a small window overlooking the alley, where the rain struck in waves, beating against the glass and then stopping, beating and then stopping, the uneven rhythm of a storm that had gone on too long. Maeve sat at the head of the table, the wool coat still draped over her shoulders, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she didn't drink, holding it only for the warmth. Gus sat across from her with his elbows resting on the table. Rado sat beside him, and he was the one who began, because Rado was always the man who asked the difficult questions. That was his job. That was why he existed within this organization. "You have enough money for a bus ticket," he said. It wasn't a question. He stated it as though reading a figure from the books. "You have enough. Not enough for Boston, but enough for other places. Places where no one knows your name, no one has a file on you, and no one is looking for you. You've been in this city for 7 months. Why haven't you left?" Maeve looked down at the cup of tea. "Because Finn is here," she said. Rado didn't understand at first. He opened his notebook, then stopped and wrote nothing. "Your brother," he said slowly. "Your brother has been gone a long time." Maeve gave one very small nod. "He's still here," she said, and for a while no one in that back room spoke again. There was only the rain striking the little window, beating and then stopping. She told the story very briefly. That was what Rado would always remember, that she didn't tell it at length, didn't lead them toward it, didn't explain. She told them only 3 things. She said there had been a morning, a doorway, and a little boy standing there holding a towel. The boy didn't unfold it. He only held it, still neatly folded, gripping it with both hands in front of his stomach the way someone held something they had no intention of using. And he stood in the doorway and said he didn't want to go. He said he didn't like crowded places. He said it twice. And his sister was standing in front of the mirror in the next room, buttoning the white shirt she had washed the night before and hung up overnight so it would be ready, the only decent shirt she still owned. And she was fastening it from the bottom upward. And she was late. And she didn't turn around. "I didn't turn around," Maeve said. That was where she paused the longest. Then she continued, her voice still flat, the voice of someone who had told this story inside her mind thousands of times, and had worn it smooth until it no longer had any sharp edges left to cut her, or so she believed. She said 3 words. "It's only 2 hours." She said she had spoken those exact 4 words to her brother without looking at him, her hands still fastening the buttons of her shirt, and then she left. And those were the last words she ever said to him. "It's only 2 hours." And when she returned, the surface of the lake was still. Maeve said nothing more. She described nothing else. She sat there holding the cup of tea, and no one in the room asked another question because no one needed to. Gus looked down at the tabletop. Rado closed his notebook, and he didn't write a single word in it. And that was the only time in many years that he listened to someone tell a story without taking notes. People keep asking me why I don't leave, Maeve said. The doctor at the clinic asked. The woman at the shelter asked. The one time they still let me inside. Everyone asks, and I can't explain it because when I say it aloud it sounds like I'm insane. But I stay because he's here. That lake is here. That house is here. The school he attended is here. If I get on a bus, where am I supposed to go? I'd be going to a city where nothing of him exists, and then he would truly be gone. She lifted her eyes, and for the first time that entire afternoon, she looked directly into Gus's eyes without turning away. I left him behind once, she said. I won't leave him behind again. Then she placed one hand on her belly, a gesture she made without realizing she was doing it, while outside the rain continued striking the small window, beating and then stopping, beating and then stopping. Gus said nothing. But he was thinking, and what he thought was that he had sat at this table for 11 years and listened to every kind of person explain why they couldn't leave a place. Because of money, because of debt, because of honor, because of a promise made to the dead. He had never heard anyone say it was because of an unopened towel. Rado was the one who asked the next question, and he asked it more gently than any question he had ever asked in his life. He asked who was looking for her. Maeve didn't answer immediately. She turned the cup of tea once between her hands, then said something no one in the room had been prepared to hear. He never touched my face, she said. Then she stopped, as though that were enough, as though everyone should understand at once. And when no one spoke, she added the rest, her voice still flat. The face is where people look, she said. People look at your face, and then they ask questions. No one asks about the other places. Gus didn't move. Rado opened his notebook, then closed it again. The mark here, Maeve said, raising one hand to touch the outer edge of her left eyebrow, touching the faint crescent-shaped scar Gus had noticed beneath the rain. This was an accident. This one really was an accident. The cup slipped out of his hand, and he apologized for this one for 3 straight days. 3 days. She lowered her hand. Only this one, she said. Then she told them the rest, and she told it slowly, far more slowly than she had told the part about Finn, because this was the part she hadn't yet worn smooth. 2 years ago, she said, the 33rd week, just like now. She said those words, then stopped for a very long time, and everyone in that back room suddenly understood why she had spent 9 days sitting on the church steps with both arms wrapped around her belly. That house had 7 stairs, she said. I remember because I counted them every day for 6 months afterward. Every time I went up, every time I came down. 7. No one asked another question. No one needed to. The hospital wrote that it was an accident, Maeve said, and I signed the paper. Gus opened his mouth, and it was the first time he had spoken since they entered that room. Why? He asked. Maeve remained silent for a very long time, long enough for the rain outside the window to strike the glass in several more waves, long enough for Rado to turn his face toward the tabletop. Because he was holding my hand, she said, too tightly. Then she told them the final part, and she said it in the calmest voice of all, and that was what made it unbearable. There was a nurse, she said. She asked me whether I wanted to see it. She stood there beside the bed, and she asked me, and she looked at me while she asked me. Then Maeve looked down at her 2 hands resting on the wooden table, thin hands with the knuckles standing out beneath the skin. He answered for me, she said. No one in the room breathed. I don't know how much it weighed, she said. They told me, but I forgot the number. The number didn't mean anything. I don't know how much it weighed. I never held it. Then she reached into the pocket of her wet sweater, the pocket she had guarded for 9 days, and took out the piece of paper folded into quarters. She placed it on the table and pushed it toward Gus with 2 fingers. It was soft as cloth. It had long ago lost the shape of a piece of paper. If I don't make it, she said, could you give this to someone, so they'll know what to call it? Gus picked up the paper. He unfolded it very carefully, because he knew it would tear if he opened it too quickly. And inside was a name written in capital letters in the handwriting of someone who wanted to make certain that whoever read it could understand, and beneath the name was a string of numbers. He looked at it for a very long time, and while he looked, he was thinking of a room above the funeral home, and a desk inside that room, and on that desk there was a framed photograph that had lain face down for 4 years, and he had never turned it over, and he couldn't explain why he hadn't thrown it away. He said nothing about that. He folded the paper along its old creases, carefully, in the proper direction, then placed it on the table and pushed it back toward her. "You don't have to ask anyone for permission to give your child a name," he said. That night, after Teddy had cleaned the back room and turned off the restaurant lights, Gus stopped Rado at the door. He didn't hand him the piece of paper. He only recited the string of numbers once, and Rado wrote it in the leather notebook without asking why. "The name too," Gus said. Rado wrote down the name, then closed the notebook and stepped out into the rain. The next day, just after Gus sat down at his table and Teddy poured his coffee without asking, Rado placed the notebook on the table. He didn't open it. "That was the first sign. The number is dead," he said. "It changed hands a long time ago. It belongs to a laundromat in Burlington now. I tried calling. A woman answered and asked whether I was calling about the coats." Gus said nothing. He looked through the window. Outside, the street was slowly drying, and someone had already towed away the silver minivan, leaving an empty space along the curb where no car dared to park. "And the name?" Gus asked. Rado slowly shook his head. "There's an elderly woman with that last name in the state," he said. "But she went into a nursing home several years ago and doesn't take calls from strangers. They said she doesn't remember anyone anymore." "Have you told her?" Gus asked. "Not yet," Rado said. "Don't," Gus said. Rado nodded and asked nothing more, because that was also his job, knowing when to stop asking questions, but Maeve already knew. Several days later, she told Gus so, and she said it during an ordinary afternoon while cleaning dust from a camera lens, without turning around or looking at him. "I know the number is dead," she said. Gus stood motionless in the doorway. "I called it," she said, 3 times. "The first time, I thought I had dialed the wrong number. The second time, I let it ring for a very long time. The third time, someone answered, and I hung up." She twisted the lens 1 notch tighter. "But if I throw it away," she said, "then I don't have anyone left." Gus didn't answer. He remained there for another moment, then walked away. And he never mentioned it again, not once, and neither did she. He didn't give her a gift. That was what Rado would later tell Sal while the two of them stood smoking in the yard, that the finest thing their boss had done wasn't giving her the coat. He gave her a job. He told her that the camera systems at 3 funeral homes and his linen warehouse had problems, that he was paying a security company with a handsome office, and they sent their invoices regularly, and he wanted to know what he was paying for. He named a price. He stated it the way he would speak to a contractor. He told her there was a small apartment above the linen shop, employee housing, and anyone who worked for the shop was allowed to live there, and if she took the job, the apartment would be hers. He didn't say a word about the rain, her belly, or her shoes. Maeve listened to everything, then asked him only one question. She asked how soon he wanted it finished. Before the end of her first week, she placed a handwritten sheet of paper in front of Rado. She didn't own a computer. She had written it in ballpoint pen on graph paper, the letters small and neatly aligned, and on it were all the places the other company had overlooked for years. She wrote that the camera at the rear gate of the funeral home on Dean Street faced a wall instead of the gate. She wrote that there was a corner inside the linen warehouse where 2 cameras both swept across it, but they crossed it at the same time, leaving a period during every cycle when the corner was completely unobserved, and she recorded exactly how long that interval lasted, and wrote that staggering the cycle of 1 camera would eliminate it. She wrote that the recorder at the main funeral home overwrote its own footage after a period far shorter than the contract required, and she wrote down the number of the clause in the contract because she had read the entire contract. Rado read the paper twice. Then he opened his leather notebook and wrote 1 line inside it, and it was the only line in that notebook he would later reread and smile at. "She's better than the bastard we're paying," he wrote. Then he turned to another page and began a new list, and at the top of that list he wrote the word diamonds. That same week, he sent out the first application for a copy of her birth certificate, and he knew it would take many months, and he didn't tell anyone, including her. At this stage of pregnancy, her belly no longer allowed her to lie down. She could rest on her left side for a while, before the pain beneath her ribs returned. She couldn't breathe on her back, and her spine couldn't endure sitting upright, so every night, sometime after midnight, Maeve got up. She had learned that lying in bed unable to sleep was the worst thing in the world, because then the mind had nothing to do except return to the places you didn't want to visit, So she put on her coat and walked 2 blocks to the main funeral home, unlocked the door with the key Rado had given her, and went to work. Working was easier than thinking. She had learned that many years ago, during the afternoon shifts in the windowless room, that if you gave your eyes something to look at, your mind would stop looking inward. That night, she intended to inspect the recorder on the first floor again. But as she passed through the hallway, she saw a light burning in the large viewing room. Only one. Every other light had been turned off, and the one that remained stood at the far end of the room, casting a small golden circle, and within that circle a man sat alone in the 3rd row, surrounded by a room full of empty chairs. He didn't turn when she entered. He knew it was her, and how he knew was something she didn't ask. "What are you doing here?" she said. "Counting chairs," Gus said. Maeve stood in the center aisle. "Chairs," she said. Gus continued staring straight ahead at the empty platform at the front of the room. 42, he said. "This room holds 42. I've known that number since I was a teenager because my father made me arrange them every Saturday night." Then he fell silent for a while. "Every chair was filled at his funeral," he said. "People had to stand along the walls. Some had to stand in the hallway. I remember an old man I had never seen before. He stood from beginning to end and refused to sit when someone offered him a place. He went quiet again. This silence lasted longer. There were only a handful of people at my wife's funeral," he said. "Not enough to fill the first row." Maeve said nothing. She stood there with one hand resting on the back of a chair. "I keep thinking about it," Gus said. "I have for years. I still think about it. She was far kinder than my father. She was kinder than all the people who filled this room that day put together. And yet," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Maeve stepped into the row and sat down. She left 3 chairs between them, no fewer. She placed both hands on her belly and looked toward the empty platform in the same direction he was facing, and for a long time neither of them spoke. There was only the faint hum of the recorder somewhere behind the wall. Then she asked, "Did you hold her?" she asked. She asked it very softly without looking at him, and the moment the question left her mouth, she knew she had done the one thing no one in the entire city dared to do. The thing Rado would never do, Sal would never do, Teddy would never do. Gus didn't answer. He remained silent for so long that she was about to apologize and rise from her chair. "There was nothing left to hold," he said. Maeve didn't flinch. She didn't turn to look at him. She didn't reach out her hand. She didn't say, "I'm so sorry." Didn't say, "I understand." Didn't say any of the things people always said when they understood nothing at all. Because she was the only person in the world sitting in that room who could understand what those words meant. She was the woman who had lain in a hospital bed and heard a nurse ask whether she wanted to see her child, and someone else had answered for her. And to this day she still didn't know how much her baby had weighed. She sat there, 3 chairs away from him, and said only one thing. "Then neither of us knows what that feels like," she said. Gus turned his head. It was the first time he had looked at her since she entered the room. He said nothing. He only looked at her, then turned back toward the front, and the 2 of them sat that way among 42 empty chairs, in a room with only one light still burning, at an hour when the entire city of Providence was asleep. Much later, Gus spoke. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Maeve nearly laughed, and the sound that escaped her felt so unfamiliar that even she startled at it. "It's 2 o'clock in the morning," she said. "Teddy has a spare key," Gus said, and that was why on a November night in Federal Hill, the man who ruled the entire neighborhood, and a woman with no last name, sat on 2 stools in the darkened kitchen of Ruggiero's, eating cold pasta, straight from an aluminum tray beneath the light of a refrigerator door, left slightly open, and neither of them spoke another word until morning. He came in the middle of the morning, and he came through the front door. That was the detail Sal couldn't make sense of. That he didn't sneak around, didn't watch from the shadows, didn't wait until dark. He parked directly in front of the linen shop, a spotless gray German sedan, and stepped out wearing an expensive long coat, fastening the buttons again before he entered, the gesture of a man preparing to walk into a meeting. Outside the car, leaning against the driver's door, stood a man in a police uniform with his arms folded across his chest. He didn't come inside. He only stood there watching the street. Rado recognized him first. He didn't say anything to anyone. He only looked at the badge, then at the name on the man's chest, and wrote it in his notebook, his hand pausing slightly on the final letter. Because Rado had already read that report. He had found it several days earlier, The report from the night 2 years ago at the house with 7 stairs. And at the bottom of that report was a signature, and that signature belonged to the man now leaning against the car door outside. Ronan Whitlock walked in and smiled. It was a genuine look of warmth, and that was the worst part. He apologized for arriving without notice. He introduced himself by his full name, clearly hiding nothing. He said he didn't want to trouble anyone. He had only come to take his wife home. Then he placed a stack of papers on the counter and turned it around so Gus could read it easily. The gesture of a man who had done this many times before and knew that paperwork had to face the proper direction. An emergency court order, signed the day before. It stated that Mrs. Whitlock lacked the capacity to care for herself, that she had left home while pregnant, that she was living under conditions that endangered the unborn child, and that her husband, as her only next of kin, had the right to demand that she be returned for medical care. Gus read it all. Then he read it again. Ronan stood there with his hands folded in front of his stomach, patient and polite, and he didn't say a single thing that could be used against him in court. "I know how unpleasant this looks," he said. "I know what she has told you. She's ill, Mr. Volpero. She has been ill for a long time, since before I ever met her, and I have tried. God knows I have tried." Then he said the words that made the entire room turn cold. "She's already showing symptoms," he said. "Her ankles. The pain on her right side. This is the 33rd week, and do you know what the 33rd week means for her? She needs a doctor right now. She needs monitoring. She needs medication. I have insurance. I have an obstetrician who has cared for her from the beginning." He looked around the linen shop, at the shelves, at Sal, at Rado. "What do you have?" he asked. And he didn't ask it provocatively. He asked in the voice of a man who genuinely wanted to know. And that was the most terrible thing about that entire morning, that he was right. Sal stepped half a pace forward. Rado placed a hand on his arm, not forcefully, merely resting it there, and spoke softly beside his ear, just loudly enough for Gus to hear. "Hitting him means letting him win," Rado said. "He only needs one bruise. He came here to collect that bruise." Sal stopped. Ronan thanked them, folded the papers, and said he would return with an officer authorized to enforce the order, speaking as casually as a man saying he would return on Tuesday. Then he walked outside, buttoned his coat, and got into the car. The uniformed man opened the door for him. The gray sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared. Gus stood outside the shop beneath the rain and watched it leave. He did nothing. He didn't raise his phone. He didn't signal to anyone. He didn't say a single word. And Sal, standing behind him, understood that this was the first time in 11 years beside this man that the man could do nothing. There was nothing here whose deliveries could be stopped. No garbage service to refuse. No sign to take down. Maeve stood at the foot of the stairs, one hand gripping the railing, and she had heard everything. "No one can beat him," she said. There were no tears in her voice. That was what made Gus turn around. "He's clean. He's always clean." Gus looked at her for a long time. Then he spoke quietly. "No one is clean," he said. "There are only people who haven't been photographed yet." Then he turned his head and looked toward the back room, where the laptop wrapped in black cloth had remained on the table since that afternoon, untouched by anyone. Rado worked through that entire night alone in the room above the funeral home, with the laptop open and his leather notebook spread beside it. He didn't search through the photographs. He had abandoned the photographs long ago, because photographs were what people knew they were taking. He searched through the things no one imagined anyone would ever read. He searched Delroy Fisk's calendar. There were no contracts, no invoices. Not one document on that computer carried Ronan Whitlock's name, and Rado knew there wouldn't be, because people didn't write down that kind of transaction. But they had to remember where they were going. That was where every careful man failed. They were cautious with records and careless with their own calendars, because a calendar existed to remind the person who kept it, and no one guarded against himself. And there, 3 months earlier, buried among a string of meaningless notes about times and fuel and parking receipts, was a single entry: W. Airport, paid cash. Rado stared at that line for a very long time. Then he typed 2 words into the search box, only 2 words. He sat motionless, watching the screen for a while, then removed his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, and straightened in his chair. "Mr. Volpero," he called. Gus was standing at the window. "That letter W," Rado said. By the following morning they had enough, not enough to take into court. Enough to understand. Wendell Pruitt had taken the job from Ronan Whitlock 3 months earlier, A meeting at the airport, cash, no paperwork, and the job had contained only one instruction: find a pregnant woman who had left a house on the north side of the city. That was all. That was the entire contract. Pruitt spread his people across Providence, and one of the places he sent them was Federal Hill, because Federal Hill was where people paid in cash and didn't ask for documents, where a woman without a name could wash dishes and no one reported her to anyone. Then Fisk sent back the first photographs, and in one of those first photographs, at the edge of the frame, behind the woman he was searching for, there was a man walking out of a restaurant. Rado delivered the rest in his usual flat voice, and that flat voice made the room colder with every word. Before he opened his company, he said, Wendell Pruitt wasn't a private investigator. He was an insurance investigator. He worked for the carrier. And the case he was assigned to write the report on, the final report he wrote before resigning and opening his own firm in Hartford, was the case involving your wife's car. Gus didn't turn around. He remained at the window with his back to the room, while the street outside slowly brightened. He wrote that there was insufficient evidence, Rado said. He wrote those exact words. 3 weeks later he resigned, and 4 months after that he had an office in Hartford with a brass sign outside the door. No one loaned him that money. No bank. I checked. Then Rado said the part the entire room had been waiting for. He isn't hunting you, he said. That's what I misunderstood from the beginning. He doesn't need you dead. If he needed you dead, you would have been dead a long time ago. He's watching you. The man sitting in that minivan wasn't sent to shoot you. He was sent to see whether you had learned the truth. To see where you went, who you met, whether anyone was digging into the old case again. For 4 years he has slept with a knife beneath his pillow because of the name he sold, and those photographs beneath the car weren't a plan. They were a lifeline, something he prepared in case you found him first. Gus still didn't turn around. Then Rado opened his briefcase and removed a sheet of paper. He didn't hand it to Gus. He placed it on the desk face down. The name is on there, he said. The person who paid him to write those words. It was on the computer. It was inside a folder he couldn't delete because he needed it to protect himself. Are you certain you want to read it? Gus turned around. He walked to the desk. He stood there looking down at the sheet of paper lying face down. An ordinary white page with a blank reverse side and nothing at all to see. Then his eyes shifted several inches to the left. There, on the same desk, exactly 1 handspan from the paper, lay a framed photograph that was also face down, and it had remained that way for 4 years. 2 objects, turned face down, on the same desk. Rado said nothing more. He rose, walked to the door, and closed it behind him. 11 days later, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Sal heard something fall. He was sitting in the car outside the linen warehouse. As he had every night since the morning a man in uniform had stood leaning against a car door, when he heard a metal rack crash somewhere inside. He entered through the side door. Maeve was lying between 2 rows of linens, and she was convulsing. Sal didn't panic. That was the only thing that happened as it should have that night. He had learned this 15 years earlier with a fire crew no one now remembered he had ever served on, and his hands still remembered. He didn't hold her head. He didn't put anything in her mouth. He pushed the fallen rack away, cleared every hard object from around her, then rolled her onto her left side, moving her whole body slowly, supporting her shoulder and hip at the same time. He took off his coat, folded it, and placed it beneath her head. Then he looked at his watch. He watched the second hand and counted, and with his other hand he called Gus without taking his eyes from it. Sal drove the entire way to the hospital, running red lights at 3 intersections in a row without slowing down once, while Gus sat in the front passenger seat, and throughout that entire drive he didn't say a single word. He didn't call anyone. He didn't give anyone an order. There was nothing whose deliveries could be stopped, no sign that could be taken down, no street anywhere in the world willing to obey him now. And the man all of Federal Hill moved aside, for when he passed, sat there gripping the handle above the car door, like an ordinary passenger. In the emergency room, they took her away in less than a minute. There was the sound of stretcher wheels, someone calling out a string of things Gus didn't understand, and a pair of swinging doors opening and closing again. Then a nurse returned, holding a clipboard, and asked what he was to her. Gus opened his mouth, then closed it. "I'm the one waiting," he said. The nurse looked at him. She wasn't being cruel. She was only tired, and there was a blank space on her form. "I need family," she said. and Gus Volparo stood in the middle of that bright white hallway with nothing to say. Ronan arrived less than half an hour later. He came carrying a thicker stack of papers than before, an order transferring her to a facility covered by his insurance, a declaration of marriage authorizing him to be listed on the birth certificate, and another document requesting that the hospital bar anyone who wasn't family from the post-operative ward. He handed the entire stack to the nurse politely, with both hands, and said he understood that everyone meant well, but she was his wife. Gus didn't hit him. He stepped forward, stood close, and spoke very softly, so softly that the nurse 3 steps away couldn't hear a word. "Your brother is standing outside in uniform," he said. "I already have a photograph of the report he signed 2 years ago." Ronan didn't move, but something changed in his face, and Gus saw it, the thing he had seen on the faces of countless men over countless years. The instant a person realized the price wouldn't be paid with what he had expected. "You can go to prison if you choose," Gus said, "but he doesn't deserve to." Then he said the final words even more quietly. "I don't need to hit you," he said. "I only need to stop keeping silent." Ronan stood there for another moment. Then he lifted the stack of papers from the counter, all of it, turned away, and walked through the automatic doors, and outside, the man in uniform beside the car looked up at him, with the face of someone who didn't understand anything yet. Then the double doors at the end of the hallway swung open, and they pushed the stretcher out, and Maeve was only half conscious, and she saw him. She tried to say something. Gus stepped close to the stretcher, bent down, and leaned his ear toward her. Her lips were blue, and her eyes couldn't focus on a single point, but she managed 3 words, clear and distinct, spoken with all the breath she had left. "Save it first," she said. Then they wheeled her away. Gus straightened. He stood there in the hallway without moving for a long time. Then he did one small thing. He removed the watch from his wrist, the scratched Timex he had worn since the day his father died, and handed it to the nurse. "Give this to her when she wakes up," he said. The nurse looked at the watch in his hand. "I'm not allowed to accept valuables, sir," she said. Gus looked down at it. "It's worth $20, he said. "It's only valuable to someone who knows whose it is." No one noticed when daylight came, because there were no windows in that hallway, only lights, and the lights never changed. Sal sat. Gus stood. He remained standing from the moment the double doors closed until the moment they opened again, and twice Sal almost said something, then stopped himself, because he knew Gus wouldn't sit down and knew there was no point in asking. Then a doctor came out, a woman wearing a surgical cap, and she searched the hallway with her eyes before looking at Gus because Gus was the only one there, and she said they were both all right. She said daughter. She said they were both all right, and she said it in the tired, calm voice of someone who had spoken those words thousands of times in her life, and she didn't understand why the large man standing before her had to reach out and grip the back of a chair. A baby girl. Small and earlier than she should have arrived, and they had taken her away to do what needed to be done, and then they brought her back. By the end of the morning, Maeve was awake, and they allowed Gus into the room, and there was sunlight inside, the pale sunlight of November filtering through the curtains and settling in a golden strip across the blanket. She was holding her. The baby was asleep. Her face was red and wrinkled, and she was breathing, and her tiny hand was gripping the edge of her mother's hospital gown the way every newborn child grips, holding on for no reason, holding on because it is the first thing they know how to do. Maeve didn't cry. That was the strange part. She didn't cry once throughout that entire morning. She only looked down at the baby, and she looked for a very long time, and every so often she shifted her from one arm to the other, as though making certain she was still holding her. She had weighed her. That was the first thing Maeve asked when she woke. She asked how much the baby weighed, and she made the nurse repeat it twice. And when the nurse repeated it the second time, Maeve nodded and closed her eyes and lay still that way for a long while. Then someone brought in the birth certificate form. There was a blank space on it, and they handed her a pen. She held the pen in the hand with the needle still inserted and began to write. She wrote the first name first, and Gus saw it, and he knew what name it was because he had held that piece of paper in his hand in the back room of Ruggiero's and folded it again along the old creases. Finnegan. Then she didn't stop writing. She added another name in the middle, and she wrote it slowly and carefully in capital letters, the handwriting of someone who wanted to make certain that whoever read it could understand. Delphine. The nurse looked down at the form and read the entire name aloud. Because that was the procedure, it had to be read back for confirmation. She spoke it clearly, both given names and the last name, inside the sunlit room, and Gus stood at the foot of the bed and heard the second name. He didn't ask, he didn't say anything at all. He only stood there for a moment, then turned and walked toward the door, moving a little too quickly, and Sal rose and followed him. What Gus didn't know, what he wouldn't know until much later, was that several days earlier Maeve had asked Teddy Ruggiero. She had asked one afternoon in the kitchen while the two of them were folding linens, and she had asked very softly, and Teddy had stopped moving for a moment before speaking that name aloud, only once, and she had said nothing more, and Maeve hadn't asked anything more. Neither of those women had told anyone. In the hallway, Gus walked several steps and then stopped. He leaned against the wall. The wall was painted pale blue, the kind of blue only hospitals used, the color people chose because they believed it made others feel calm. He stood against it, a large man in an expensive wool suit, and raised one hand to cover his eyes. He made no sound. His shoulders didn't shake. He simply stood there with his hand over his eyes, and he remained that way for a very long time. Sal stopped several steps away. He didn't approach. He turned his back and stood blocking the hallway, and he stayed that way while several people passed, an orderly pushing a cart, an old man walking with a cane, two people talking about where they had parked, and not one of them glanced at the man leaning against the wall. No one in that hallway knew who he was. No one knew that on the other side of the city, an entire street moved aside when he walked through it. Here, he was only a man leaning against a hospital wall near noon, and people passed him, and people left him alone, because in this hallway that happened every day. That night, Gus went up to the room above the funeral home and sat down at the desk, and he remained there for a very long time, without turning on the overhead light, with only the desk lamp burning. Then he reached out and turned the framed photograph face up. It had lain face-tone for 4 years. He turned it over and looked at it, and inside the frame was a woman laughing at the person holding the camera, with one hand resting on her belly, the way every woman at that stage of pregnancy rested her hand there, without thinking, without posing, simply placing it there because that was where her hand wanted to be. Gus looked at the photograph for a very long time. Then he took another photograph from his coat pocket, one recently taken on a phone and printed at a shop down the street, and in it was a woman with hair damp from sweat, her face pale with exhaustion, holding a baby in a sunlit room. He placed the two photographs beside each other on the desk. Then he picked up the remaining sheet of paper, the one that had lain face down since that day, and handed it to Rado without turning it over. "Burn it," he said. Rado didn't take it immediately. "You only need to know one name," he said. "Just one name. It has been 4 years. Gus didn't answer at once. He rose and walked to the window, and he looked down at the small window of the security room on the ground floor, where the light was still burning because someone was still working there at that hour. "If I learn that name," he said, "then I'll have to go. You know I'll have to go. And if I go, I won't come back." Then he returned to the desk and placed one hand on the frame, on the photograph of the woman laughing with one hand resting on her belly, and he spoke his final words. "She wouldn't want me to trade that little girl for a name," he said. Rado took the paper. He didn't open it, and later he would tell Sal that he had never read it either, and Sal believed him. Rado placed the sheet inside the glass ashtray on the desk and set it alight, and the two men stood watching until it had burned completely, slowly curling, blackening, then crumbling into ash, while the room filled with nothing but the smell of scorched paper and the glow of a single desk lamp. A few months later, everything had changed. The list Rado had begun in his leather notebook that night, the list with the word diamonds written at the top of the page, had completed its journey through applications, hearings, and months of waiting exactly as he had known it would. And at last Maeve Callahan had a name in the records of the state. She had a copy of her birth certificate. She had a new driver's license. She had a tax identification number. She had a title printed on her identification card, Director of Security, and she was on the payroll, and she paid taxes the way everyone paid taxes, and it wasn't a favor but a job, and she did it better than anyone the organization had ever hired. Ronan Whitlock was sentenced, and what the court convicted him on wasn't one person's word against another's, but the emergency room bills paid in cash under his wife's name, many of them within a short period of time. records he had kept with his own hands because he was an accountant, and accountants didn't throw away receipts. His brother lost his badge, and he lost it because of his own signature on a report, because he had falsified an official record, not because he had a brother. Inside Maeve's wallet, in the exact place where the piece of paper folded into quarters had once rested, there was now an employee identification card bearing her photograph. She still kept the other piece of paper. She stored it at home inside a box, and she never unfolded it again. And around her wrist was a scratched Timex, its band shortened by several notches to fit. No one explained it. No one needed to. The final scene of this story took place on an ordinary afternoon inside the security room on the ground floor, where Maeve sat before her row of monitors. The little girl was sitting on her lap, laughing with the laughter of a child who knew nothing about the world beyond that room and didn't need to know yet, reaching toward the small blinking light on the desk. Gus stood in the doorway. He didn't enter. "Do you need something?" she asked. "No," he said. He remained there. Maeve looked up at him for a moment, then smiled. "Then come in," she said. And he did. When he left, she walked him to the door, and in the hallway she stopped in front of Sal, who was standing where he always stood. "The coffee," she said. "Those 9 days, that was you, wasn't it?" Sal didn't answer. He only nodded once, and sometimes the person who saves you isn't a good man. Sometimes it is simply the only person willing to look at you. Truly look. Look for a long time. Look until you have a name. This story leaves us with something very simple. That dignity isn't something we bestow upon other people, but something we return to them by offering them work instead of pity, by asking what they can eat instead of asking where they went wrong, and by listening when someone has finally spoken, even when they speak very softly, even when they say it only once. So many people around us are standing on some set of steps, and they have been there for days, and all they need isn't a miracle, but one person willing to turn around. If this story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share it so we can continue listening to more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Which character remained in your heart the longest, and have you ever been the person who turned around? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what you feel from the deepest place in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.